Hello, my darlings. Hi. Hi, sweetheart. It's me, your soft mommy Amber. I'm here. I made it. I hope that you are having a wonderful, a splendid, and a stellar evening tonight, or whichever time of day your particular time zone permits. But I am most happy that you could spend your time with me because tonight we'll be having a very special stream. As I promised before, I wanted to do some actual story reading. So, tonight will be the night. So, everyone who's listening to my voice tonight, I hope that you will be most comfortable, snuggled up into a nice blanket, just absolutely happy in your own little space, and especially happy now that I am here with you. Hello, hi there. Just a sad lurker, happy to see you. Do get comfy. And in any case, anyone who comes in here tonight, you are all welcome, and I'm happy to see all of you. Oh, and there are my darlings, LJ and Sam. Welcome in, welcome in. I hope you managed to have a lovely time today because I was certainly busy. Oh, LJ, you got the redeem. Well done for being first in. I really do have to think of more nice things to treat you with my usual Stardust points. You never normally bother with that, so why this time? I'll just be vibing, not feeling emotionally great. I understand, yeah. Sometimes life can be very tough on us, but that's why we gather here to simply not think about those things, maybe just for a little while, and instead just to have my voice speak to you. Tonight it will be some very gentle fairy tales. So I hope that particular kind of story will be able to take your mind off things, or at least temporarily give it something else to think about. Is that the amber pine? Well, of course, Iroh. Is that the most wonderful Iroh? I am blessed with your presence tonight, darling. I hope that you have a nice cup of tea with you and you are cozy as can be. Hurrah! Welcome on in. What is it that you just called me? Amber Pimbus? Why? Why would you say such a thing? Hurrah! Phil, hi. Welcome. I'm very happy to see you here and thank you so much for the follow. I really do. I really do appreciate it. I'm glad you're here. I really am. Now, I don't know. I just gave blood. I'm loopy as shit. Hurrah. Do take care of yourself. Make sure to drink some orange juice. Maybe grab a chocolate cookie. Lay down. And if you do happen to fall asleep, well, in that case, that's exactly what I want, isn't it? Phil, I see your hydrates. I see them. Okay, okay. I have I have a very nice cup of green tea, so I will help myself to that. Mm. Yeah, much better for my throat. Both chocolate and cookie have milk in them. Oh, well, dairy free. I'm sure there has to be a good alternative, right? Something that's not going to outright kill you. Iro, you have a knife. My favorite emote. I love it so much. Made by our one and only glorious bard. Okay, okay. Everyone, I hope that you are being comfy and cozy because I should probably pin a message in chat that while I am in the middle of reading one of the stories, I won't exactly be looking at what you guys are saying, but absolutely do feel free to either comment along or just voice your thoughts or, just go ahead with whatever cozy or happy emotes you have. I always do love seeing them. But most importantly, I want you to be comfortable. I want you to have a good evening with just my voice. And for a couple of hours, I will take you into the world of Swiss fairy tales. Sin! Thank you for the hydrate. Mommy! Darling, yes, of course. I'll drink some water to your name. Mm. Yeah, I'm certainly going to I'm certainly going to need to keep up with the hydrates tonight, not to just completely destroy my voice, but I'll do my best. Beb. Hi to you as well, sweethearts. Come here. Come sit in my lap. I will be so happy to have you. Okay, so, ooh, and there is something that I should show you, right? I should show you the nice little overlay that I have for my reading stream. I think it's quite nice. I put together a couple of assets and I have a little reading room for myself. Fingers crossed I set up all of my mics and everything in there as well. All right, here we are in the reading room. Oh, thank you so much for the follow, Grobus. Oh, and there goes our goal of 120 followers. That's so nice of you. That is very kind. Oh, I am most happy to see so many sweethearts. Yeah, 120. Goodness, that's a lot of people. I can't even imagine that many people in one room. But here you are. And at least some of you will be here to listen to what I have to say tonight. There's going to be quite a lot of stories in this book, and I am getting them off of the world's most convenient site for reading, which is the Gutenberg Project. They have done a marvelous job of compiling freely available texts, and it's actually a very valuable resource in terms of text mining and machine learning text analysis. Project Gutenberg. I will link to it probably somewhere on my Twitter if you are interested, or, you know, if you're able to Google that, then go on ahead. Gutenberg, yes, exactly, Grobus, just like that. Moogie, hi, yes, it's mommy time. Look, I even have a fancy room with some soft lighting. So, everyone, let's start with the very first part. Yeah? So this is Swiss Fairy Tales by William Elliot Griffis. The first part is called How Swiss Fairy Tales Came to America. Let us pretend that we are sitting on a stool, a rug, or the floor around the chair of Grandmother Hess, to which place all young folks are hereby invited. We shall go with her in fancy to the home of the Swiss family Harby, for that was her maiden name, at Barren Hill, in what the Swiss folk called the Pennsylvanias. For they loved the forests, and they knew that the name meant the groves or woods of Penn. They kept always in their minds the idea of trees. It was there that some of these fairy and other tales were first told. It was long ago, during the Revolutionary War, when Washington and Lafayette and Steuben were comrades at Valley Forge. This place was only a few miles away, and the great men rode often past the house and farm of John Harby, who was great-grandma's father. When, in 1778, the Hessians and Redcoats could not capture Lafayette with his continental soldiers, they stole the bread out of the oven and drank up the milk from the spring house. The little girls, Sarah, Hannah, and Margaret, often heard from their grandfather and grandmother about Switzerland, whence, following William Penn, they had come. Their kinsfolk still lived in the old land across the sea. When the Revolutionary War was over, their father, John Harby, came to the Quaker City and kept a hotel. There, when Philadelphia was the national capital, he entertained members of Congress and the refugee French noblemen. When the storyteller heard the once little maids talk about things Swiss and Hessian and British and Pennsylvanian, these three, two of whom the Hessians had once scared into the garret, were dear old ladies, sitting up in bed or in her chair, as straight as her rheumatism and her bent fingers would allow. Grandmother told us many a tale of Swiss ancestral and revolutionary times. To the end of the years of her life, which lasted from 1770 to 1866, her sister Hannah, our maiden aunt, sang the songs, played on the piano with ditties, and danced the minuets and waltzes which the French officers and noblemen had taught her when the Quaker City from 1790 to 1800 was the national capital. We children, even when big girls and boys and ready for college, enjoyed the fun, the music, and the stories. It was from these dear old ladies that the storyteller learned to love the mountains and to climb them in America and Japan, and for weeks at a time to tramp along them in glorious Switzerland. The ancestral Swiss home was in a valley of the Bernese Oberland, under the shadow of a high mountain. In winter, which usually lasted 7 months or more, the people, the boys and the girls, the cows, goats, donkeys, horses, chickens, and all living things were shut in by heavy snow. Quite often in winter, Daddy and the boys had to climb out the windows onto the snows that were piled or drifted many feet high against the door. Even on May Day, spoiling fun outdoors, there might come a storm which left 6 or 8 feet of snow. Yet when the sun got up early in the morning, and the south wind blew with a quiet force that did more in a day's work than a million steam shovels, the snow melted, and soon the green meadows were spangled with red and blue, yellow and white flowers. When June came, the big boys got ready with their fathers and hired men to leave their village home and go up to spend the whole summer on the spicy pastures, that is, the Alps, high up on the mountains, to stay until near October. There the bees would gather honey from the nectar in the blossoms, and cows would feed on the sweet juices of the grass. It was at this season that the milk, cream, butter, and cheese were the very best of the year. Many a growing boy, counting on his fingers the days, looked forward for months to life outdoors, on the highlands, among the birds, the butterflies, and the wild animals. As for the cattle, they could sniff the sweet aroma of the flowery fields and grasses at a distance, and long before men could. The day of the great cow parade, when the other four-footed animals, dogs, goats, pigs, horses, and donkeys, joining in, was the greatest of the year. Then the leading cow, named Lady, or Queenie, or Cleopatra, often carrying the milking stool on her head between her horns, led the procession. The girls were all out in their best clothes to deck the hats of the daddies with wreaths and blossoms, and to say and wave goodbyes. Pretty nearly everyone was decorated with flowers. Then the music and the yodel songs and the blowing of the pine wood horns began. Those awoke the echoes of the distant mountains. Then the sounds returning seemed as sweet as the singing by a choir of the heavenly host. No Swiss boy or girl, even when grown up, living in the cities or in a foreign land, ever forgot the yodel songs or the hymns his mother used to sing. The Swiss chateau, home of the Harbys, before the year 1710, except the first story, which was of stone, was entirely of wood. In winter, the fireplace of brick roared with logs of fir, birch, or oak. The great white porcelain stove, 8 feet high, banded with shining brass, in which peat or coal was the fuel, stood at one end of the main room. To get into the house, the door, in the front center, opened into the basement, but there were 2 stairways on the outside, which took one up into the bedrooms. To let the heavy snow slide off easily to the ground, the eaves projected from the roof 6 feet beyond and over the walls. Within the projecting front gable, between the sloping roof and the second story, there was a balcony. The whole front of the house was nearly hidden by vines and flowers that invited the bees and birds, though there were hives and dovecotes in the yard space fronting the house. Cut into the corner columns or through the gable boards was this scripture sentence: "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Not far away was the barn and yard for the cows and chickens, ducks and geese. Nearby, the purling of a running brook, fed from the mountain with water cold and clear as crystal, was like the singing of a sweet song. As neat as a new pin was this spring house. Here upon shelves, only a little higher than the stream, was on the stone surface that ran across one side of the low room, or floating in the cold water, were shallow pans for the milk. In the corner stood the big jar to hold the cream, which was daily skimmed from the milk in the pans. The cauldron and utensils for cheese making were kept in another corner. It was from cheese chiefly that the family lived, especially in winter. On the walls of the sleeping chambers, parlors, and living room, besides the well-mounted antlers of the wild mountain goat, there were framed pictures of the great men of the fatherland. Here looked down the face of the holy Saint Fridolin, or the former Zwinglius, or the heroes William Tell and Arnold von Winkelried. In some houses, one could see a picture of Calvin, or a view of Geneva, or the seal of the canton in which they lived. In a glass-covered case were dried alpine flowers, rock roses, violets, and anemones, with their colors kept wonderfully fresh, even in winter. When first plucked, they were put in hot sand, not too hot, and covered for a time. For breakfast, the Harbys had honey, bread, milk, and eggs. On the wall, resting on pegs, was the father's gun for hunting. It was a real rifle, and few men in the world, except the Swiss and the Jäger, or hunters, then knew of this wonderful weapon. For dinner, they often had chamois or ibex, and occasionally bear meat, for John Harby was a dead shot with the rifle. Beef with greens was common, though the chief staple of food was cheese, or cream cooked in many wonderful ways, with cheesecake or pie, though buttermilk was in daily demand. What the young folks liked best of all was the weekly treat of schnitzel. This was made of boiled ham, dumplings of wheat flour, dried apples and spices, and was served on the table with molasses. When nicely cooked, and as mother knew how to make it, nothing tasted better. It was enjoyed until the waist belts of youngsters began to tighten. Every morning, the doors of the clock, set in a box or house on the wall, flew open, and the cuckoo chirped its song and then retired inside from view. The wooden bird thus gave notice that it was time to get up and make ready for school. At night, before the children went to sleep, mother and sometimes daddy told them fairy or wonder tales, or of the heroes that had made Switzerland free, or the Bible stories, till they knew these by heart, and when they grew up, told them to their children. With the young men of the village, it was not always work. In winter with the cows and goats, in the dairy at home, or in summer the driving of the flock up to the mountain pastures, with the cheese making there. Tired of the monotony of country life, the sturdy lads welcomed the advent of the soldiers in bright uniforms, with a band of music and the recruiting officer at their head. With their flags and banners, these strangers came from the great world outside to enlist young men for military service in France or Germany, or for the Scotch Brigade in the Netherlands, or to serve the King of England in America. All the village folk turned out, and the mothers and maidens were as eager as the fathers to see how it was done before their sons, brothers, and sweethearts marched away. Not least among these Swiss who gained fame was General Henry Bouquet, who in the British service and as a comrade of Washington won Pittsburgh for the king. For these were the gala days of the monarchs and of the soldier of fortune, that is, of the brave young man who left his home and country to fight for anyone who paid him well. He enlisted more for love of adventure than for love of the ruler whose splendid uniform he wore. Yet his loyalty and honor were steadfast. Faithful and brave, he lived in camps and barracks, fought battles, and died in the hospital or on the field. When the king's officer raised his banner aloft in the public square of the Swiss village, the fifer and drummer or trumpeter sounded the call. On one side of the broad table, well furnished, and with a foaming pitcher and cups to drink the king's health, sat the notary. Then up came the stalwart young fellows in their working clothes to have their names enrolled, to take the oath of allegiance, and to exchange their pitchforks for muskets, bayonets, and cartridge boxes. Then they took their places with the others, and soon wore soldier clothes with shining buttons and frontlets of brass on their helmets. Often it was hard, not only for parents and sisters, but for the pet dogs to leave the dear masters. Many were the tears shed, and lively the gossip among the women at and around the well curb when the village had again resumed its quiet life. Greater yet was the glory when the lad who had left in peasant homespun returned in the royal uniform to tell of camps and battles and sieges. Yes, even of places and the splendor of the great cities far away. Buttons were a new fashion then, and the Swiss soldiers came back home in cocked hat, a coat very much dotted with shining brass, and open to show the vest and facings, and with leggings reaching from ankle to knee. A high private in those days looked as beautiful as a tropical bird and as handsome as a prince. Thank you, Azalea Archivist, for the raid. Come in, get cozy. I'll be reading. But I see you, and thank you for bringing in all of your sweethearts. Let's continue with the story, shall we? The boys left their hoops, and the girls their dolls, to run and welcome the returning hero. Old and young listened to his war stories, and even the dogs and pigeons seemed to share in the joy. The imagination of the youngsters was fired, and often maidens followed their lovers to distant countries. Who has not read in the pages of Froissart or Macaulay or Appenzel's stout infantry, or of the valor and devotion of the Swiss Guard in the Tuileries to Paris, who died to defend their master? In their everlasting honor, one sees at Lucerne, sculptured out of the solid rock, the dying lion. This splendid work of art symbolizes the loyalty and valor of the 786 victims of the French mob in 1793. While the young men had the opportunity to see the great world beyond the mountains, most of the girls stayed at home in the valleys. Yet all the time they thought of their brothers, lovers, and kinsmen. They too longed to see a real prince, and to look on a military pageant, and gaze on the splendor of courts and palaces. At times it was hard to restrain the maidens from roaming off down the Rhine to the rich and colorful city of Amsterdam, or to the brilliancy of Paris. It was not alone in Europe that the absentees from the Swiss villages started. Already late in the 18th century, men of the Grisons and Oberland were hearing of the Pennsylvanians. The William Penn country was luring the stalwarts away, for reports came across seas as sweet in sound as yodel songs, or as alpine echoes, a fertile soul which was dirt cheap. The kind ruler of the forests of Penn hated war and treated even the wild men kindly. He bought their land and paid them for it, even though his king Charles called it his own, which his friend Roger Williams denied. Sometimes a Swiss mother left a widow because her husband had been killed in some prince's battle, resolved not to let her boy die for a king. So she strapped her baby on her back and skated down the Rhine to Rotterdam and reached America. One of these, well known, married again, and Philadelphia reared a fine family of splendid boys and girls. Such a romantic incident happened more than once. Hardly had the Harbys begun even to talk about Penn's land when a terrible calamity befell them, which drove them out of their nest-like home, even as the mother eagle pushes out her fledglings, while the wonderful opportunity offered them in Penn's groves lured them to even greater ease and comforts. Across the Atlantic, there would be less of toil than in their mountain home, with its long months of winter and its short weeks of summer. The story would take too much time to tell if we tried to note every detail. For a week previous, the snow had fallen continuously. It darkened the air and covered the earth with many feet of solid whiteness. One old man was full of forebodings of calamity. On the edge of a cliff, far up on the mountain side, mighty masses of snow piled up stood like a lofty tower, in terrible menace likely soon to fall. All were hoping for the föhn, or south wind, to blow and eat up the snow. Unsuspecting a storm, a hunter had, some days before, got among the heights, taking his provisions and blanket, hoping to stall an ibex, or at least a chamois. Caught in the sudden blinding whirling snow and unable to find the path homeward, he built a rude shelter at the edge of the forest. This was opposite an overhanging rock, under the snow tower, which was steadily rising in height. Having enough rations in his wallet to last him 4 days, he waited till sunshine should come, hoping to see a troop of ibex making their way down over the narrow ledge of rock in search of moss for food. Fortunately for him, but calamitously for the village, his rifle shot down a fat buck. Yet, immediately upon that shock of the air, following the gunfire and report, fell tons upon tons of snow and ice. The mass rolling down with lightning speed increased in size at every yard. It fell on the village, overwhelming houses, barns, stables, and gardens. Where yesterday were happy homes were now many human victims. Today, the moldering stones in the churchyard witness to the awful catastrophe. Pathetic is a similar record, made 10 years later in another village. Dear God, what sorrow! 88 in a single tomb. Happily, the Harby home, being on the edge of the avalanche's track, though flattened out like a sheet of mussed up paper, had no human dead within its walls, though in the barn every living animal was smothered by the weight of white. Digging out a few necessary things, including the trusty rifle, unharmed, they packed them up because they would be very necessary in the new home, or because they were linked with affectionate memories. They were happy in finding the stocking full of coin, which had been hidden behind a loose stone in the fireplace. When the family made its way to Basel on the Rhine, there they took a boat down the river to Rotterdam, where with hundreds of other Swiss folk they were sheltered, helped, and kindly treated by the Dutch ministers and people. Going on board the ship Arms of Rotterdam, under the tricolour flag, red, white, and blue of the Republic, they crossed the Atlantic, and in Penn's Holly Experiment, where thousands of Swiss folk had arrived before them, they reached safely the city of brotherly love. It was then larger than a village. When the people from Wales, England, Holland, and Germany first came and were building their houses, they had lived in caves on the banks of the Delaware River, where now is Front Street. But when Harpies arrived, there were hundreds of completed houses, some in brick or stone, but mostly in wood. Yet, even from the beginning, the land was properly surveyed and laid out in squares, and with 4 large parks, and planted with trees, while some of the streets were paved. In truth, for order and beauty and liberal ideas, this was the Queen City of America. And that is the end of the first chapter. All right, let me have a look at all of my sweethearts. Thank you so much, Azalea Archivist, for the raid, and welcome in everyone who came along. I am your Amber Antiquary tonight, Amber Pine, here to read you some comforting stories and just put you to sleep, or just generally hope that you enjoy your time here with me. Yes, thank you. And thank you everyone for giving me a follow. You are very sweet. I'm happy to have you all here. Who wrote this and when? It has been a very long time. I believe the date of this book is oh, well before the 1920s. Hmm. Does it have an original publishing year? I don't see anything before 1920, so it must have been around then. And the author is William Elliot Griffis. Oh, Mookie, thank you so much for the hydrate. You are very right, and I should certainly do that before moving on to the next story. Now, I hope everyone is comfy, and if it is nighttime for you, I hope that you are falling asleep softly to the sound of my voice, because that's the only thing I want. I just want to comfort you. I just want you to relax your shoulders and let all of that tension out of them. Mm. I want you to imagine that I am there by your side, slowly stroking your hair and just smiling as I see you resting. for nothing would make me happier than your comfort. Okay, I think we can go ahead and move on to the second chapter, which is titled The Swiss Home Near Valley Forge. And the story goes like this. Only a few days did the Harpies abide on the banks of the Delaware, in the little city of brotherly love, where lived a few hundred people, mostly friends in drab clothes. Then, from one of William Penn's land agents, the ancestor of American bishops, John Harpy bought a farm. It lay on a piece of high ground at Barren Hill, which was part of a ridge near the Schuylkill River. It was named after the bears that were still numerous in the forests that then clotted the land. It is known as Lafayette Hill, and we shall soon see why. The neighborhood afforded good hunting for any young man that had brought his rifle with him. One of the active fellows, who was reckoned a sure shot, was Harby's nephew, of whom we shall hear later. He shot many deer, and the family had venison often. Not far away was White Marsh. Over in another direction was Fox Chase, where they had hounds and hunted foxes. Only a few miles distant, across the hidden stream, or Schuylkill, as the Dutch had named the river, was the Valley Forge, where the farmers in the region around had their tools made and mended. Not far away on the hill was soon built St. Peter's Lutheran Church. In Switzerland, the Harbys had been members of the Reformed Church, but all the people of the neighborhood now worshipped together. The Harbys made their house first of logs of wood, notched at the corners. Trees were plentiful, and the forest was near at hand. Many things were about them to remind them of their old home, though there were no glaciers or avalanches or high mountains, with snow lying on them all the year round, and all was yet rough in the new country. When the barn had been built, the cows, pigs, and fowls made things look friendly and sociable. They had no cuckoo clock any more, but it was really homelike to hear the chickens crow at sunrise. The sound was certainly much pleasanter, indeed, than to hear the howling of the wolves at night. Occasionally, early in the morning, the Harpies would see a bear in the barnyard, and they had to keep the chickens locked up in the chicken house, for foxes were plentiful and always on the watch for a poultry dinner. Wild turkeys, a new sort of bird for them, and wild pigeons were plentiful. Benjamin Franklin, who was then a little boy in Boston, the oldest in a family of 17 children, when the grown man wanted to make the wild turkey, which gives food to man, the national emblem instead of the eagle that lives on flesh and kills little birds. Inside the house, there were wide seats at the chimney side, and cats purred in front of the great hearth fire. Outside, the dogs kept watch and ward, and often had a lively tussle with wolves and young bears. When springtime came, the girls went blossom hunting. One very common flower, which they had known in Switzerland, the pearly everlasting, somehow reminded them of the Edelweiss. Daddy, who loved trees almost to worship, saluted the same species as those which he had seen growing in the old world: fir, birch, pine, and oak. But the persimmon tree was new to him, and he enjoyed the autumn fruit, which the frost seemed to ripen, while the sugar maple was as good as a fairy tale, for the idea of a tree bearing candy was wonderful. In fact, the Harbys hailed the trees as friends, true and tried, with reverence and awe. A generation came and went, and soon there was a little God's acre around the little church on the hilltop. The Hess family from Zurich also had made their home nearby at Whitemarsh, and several couples of the young men and maidens of the two households made love and married together. The fathers and mothers who had known the old homeland beyond the sea talked often of ibex and edelweiss and the rock roses and the meadow flowers and the cows and the yodel music. When they spoke of the Alps, they meant the summer pastures high up and not mountains. At times, especially in June, they felt homesick for the yodel songs and the alpine horn echoes. They spoke often of the curious things at Neuchâtel and Bern and Zurich and the Lake of the Four Cantons. They sang the hymns of Heimat, or of home, and of the fatherland, and of the heavenly land, and recounted the exploits of the Swiss heroes. The children were taught not to be afraid of the dark, and all knew by heart many hymns, especially that beginning: Alone, yet not alone, with God am I. On the other hand, the new generation told of other game: deer, bear, wolf, wild turkey, and pigeons, and of new fruits like the persimmon. Their model in civil life was the good governor, William Penn, and their hero in valor and rescue of captives was Colonel Bouquet, the Swiss soldier in the service of their sovereign, Queen Anne. They loved her also because she loved the yodel music. Later came the kings named George. The flag over them was the Union Jack, which they saw float on the staff when they went to Philadelphia often, and occasionally to Lancaster. Yet all this time, one great desire and romantic longing of the maidens was unfulfilled. The yearning of the girls as they became sweethearts, wives, and mothers was handed down, as if it were a family heirloom, to see a real prince or a nobleman or a man with a title. They hoped that some officer in resplendent uniform, such as they had seen in their home village, would come into the neighborhood, for they were tired of Quaker drab. Even though their grandparents were democratic by their Swiss inheritance and almost by instinct, and though reared in the oldest of republics and accustomed to town meetings, the little maids Sarah and Hannah longed to see a real pageant, a prince, or at least a marquis, and something of the pomp of courts or even of armies. They heard that the Prince of Wales, who became King George II, had indeed visited New York and skated on the ice of the Collect Pond. But he had come and gone as a private person, and it was not likely that either he, again, or even King George III would ever visit the colonies. Before the two little girls could know what it all meant, the Harbys heard, in their home at Barron Hill, of the Continental Congress, held in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. In this gathering, Canada was represented. Then it was hoped that there would be 14 stripes in the flag, which the Philadelphia City Troop of Cavalry were making. But when their flag was unfurled and the handsome horseman escorted Colonel George Washington of Virginia to Cambridge, many felt very sorry that there were only 13 instead of the longed for 14 stripes, and hoped even yet that Canada would join. War broke out. From the new State House in Philadelphia, then one of the most wonderful buildings in any of the colonies, floated the flag of 13 stripes, red and white, and independence was proclaimed. Then, after 2 years, this same flag had as many stars in its blue field. Yet the armies of the Congress met with many disasters, and one day the little girls out in the garden heard the boom of the cannon at Brandywine. It was not very long afterward that the Continentals marched past the house to make camp and winter quarters at Valley Forge. Among the young men riding on horses was Washington's bodyguard of young troopers, who were mostly Pennsylvania Swiss or Germans, was John Harby's nephew, Gustav. At the camp, besides being an orderly at headquarters, it was his special duty to raise at sunrise and lower at sunset the 13-striped flag, which now bore no longer the British Union Jack, but a blue field, in which in a circle of glory were 13 stars. And he and his comrades rejoiced that the colonies had been made independent, and each stripe and star stood for a state, and all in a union. It was his people that, first of all, spoke of Washington as the father of his country, or, as the minister said, Pater Patriae. The winter of 1777 to 78 had nearly passed, and many a skirmish between the British foraging parties of Hessians and Redcoats and the American Colonel Sheldon's dragoons had taken place. One fine morning in the spring, while Gustav was taking breakfast with his little cousins at the Harbys, all were startled by the firing of guns at Valley Forge. Evidently, the Continentals were busy burning powder. But why? A battle? Asked the mother as she glanced at her husband. At the first roll of the echoes, the young trooper, Gustav, put on his bearskin cap, seized his carbine, and rushed out to hear. Putting his ear to the ground, he made up his mind that the reports were too regular for war. Then, entering the house, he declared it must be a salvo or joy volley. For what, I wonder? Asked Miss Hardy. I know, said Daddy. We have been waiting for news of the alliance with France. Now our Continentals and the sparkling Bourbonnières will march together. Whole companies among these are our Swiss boys. Then he hummed joyfully, and the old journal tune of Yankee Doodle. Perhaps now a French fleet would come up the Delaware, blockade Philadelphia, and capture Howe's army, as Burgon had been captured. At the table, they kept on talking a long time. Only a few days later, a line of wagons, driven up from a southern port, brought in supplies from France. 5 of the wagons contained saddles, stirrups, and a full equipment made in France for that whole regiment of Colonel Sheldon's cavalry which had been at first raised in Connecticut. This was Lafayette's own gift and had been paid from out of his own purse. The Continental Congress had given him a commission in the American Army with the rank of Major General. Why, that sounds like a prince, murmured little Sarah to herself. A few days later, and another surprise broke the monotony of life at Barren Hill. Washington wished to know what the British in Philadelphia were going to do. Would they attack him? Or, considering his military position too strong to risk assault, would they retire to New York? Would Washington capture or be captured? So, May 18, 1778, the commander-in-chief, who trusted the young French nobleman as fully as he would trust his oldest general, placed 2,200 of his best soldiers and 5 cannon under his charge. So Lafayette led his force out and took up to a strong position on Barren Hill. This movement was quickly known in Philadelphia, and at once 3 columns of British and Hessians marched to entrap and capture Lafayette and the Continentals. All this is national history, yet it was like a fairy tale to the little Harby maids, Sarah and Hannah, to see the Continental soldiers, now so proud of their drilling during the long winter, by Baron Steuben. Father Hesse, the night before, had sent to the nobleman from over the great sea an invitation to breakfast. You may be sure that Miss Harby got out her best gold-rimmed china cups and saucers, and her caraway seed cakes, her Zurich cookies, and her best Dutch cake and silver teapot to set before the real, live marquise. When she told her 2 small daughters that she would let them wait on the young nobleman, they clapped their hands in joy. At last they were to see, not indeed a prince, but a nobleman who had been at court, talked with the mighty monarch, and who had a bride and a chateau in France. The little girls, as they brought Lafayette his food, noticed his deep red hair, his fine forehead, his pleasing mouth and firm chin, but most of all his clear hazel eyes. More than once he smiled his thanks, and this was what they longed after and what they told most about. In fact, the great man's features seemed to bespeak strength more than beauty, but this was what all the Harbys liked. Did the British capture Lafayette? Did he show fear when Gustav Hess, the scout, rode up and told of 3 columns of redcoats marching by different roads? 2 were on one side of the Schuylkill River, and 1 on the other. Surely, with their 5,000 men, they would, as they fully expected, trap the Marquis, and they might even bag his whole force. A ship was actually waiting in the Delaware River to take the young Frenchman a captive to London. Indeed, Lord Howe had invited some handsome Tory ladies to dinner, expecting to outwit Washington and to have the young Frenchman to sit as guest and captive. But the young general spoiled this game. Mounting his horse, he ordered out what military men called false heads of columns. This made the British, who knew not what might be behind these front files, halt until reinforced. Then they deployed, and bringing up their cannon, sent a round shot that smashed the axle tree of one of Lafayette's field pieces. Must then the young Frenchman abandon his gun and face Washington with one of his cannon lost by capture? Not he. Turning the heads of their horses, the artillerymen of the Continentals drove into the Harby farmyard, drew out a wagon, lashed the dismounted cannon to the hind axle, hitched on the team, and whipping up the steeds, the whole battery dashed toward Matson's Ford and reached safely the camp at Valley Forge. 7 gallant American lads, in the rear guard of the young Continentals, died in the fight to save the guns for their country. But the rest of that breakfast, and all there was in the spring house, pantry, kitchen, and even the ovens, was eaten by the hot and the hungry and mad and disappointed Hessians. The 2 little girls lived to tell what they had seen, and another little sister, born before the war was over, stood with them on Chestnut Street in 1824 to see the Marquis de Lafayette again. He was riding in the parade, and amid the general joy, when the city troop, with their old 13-striped flag of 1775, escorted the aged friend of America, and the same cannon that was saved at Boren Hill thundered welcome from its iron throat. And that's the end of the second story. Ah, Dark Side, thank you so much for the stretch redeem. I will most certainly use it. I will also take a little sip of my tea, hoping that all of my sweethearts here with me are having a lovely and comfortable time. I am certainly enjoying myself. Although, to tell the truth, the first 2 stories sounded more like the history of America than fairy tales from Switzerland. But I suppose it was just a prologue, a little bit of background to understand where these families come from and how it is that any of these stories came to be. Because I suppose they all have to start somewhere. And these stories started with a family that lived in the mountains and eventually made their way over to America. And I like to think that it is quite interesting to see how these young girls thought that stories of an army and of courts and princes were as much of a fairy tale to them as strange things of giants and fairies would be to us. I look forward to the third part of this book, and I hope that you look forward to it as well, because that is exactly what I will set out to read now. Mm. Do make sure that you have a comforting blanket around you and maybe something nice and warm to drink. And I hope that your eyes are all heavy and sleepy and that you will feel so comforted. And I will bring you the rest and gentleness that you deserve. So, our third story is called The Wonderful Alpine Horn, and it goes like this. When the little boys and girls who read these Swiss fairy tales grow up to be big and travel in Switzerland, they will enjoy the Alpine Horn. Nearly every shepherd laid in the mountains knows how to blow it. It is made of wood and is about half as long as an ordinary broom. Its butt or heavy end rests on the ground. When a man blows a long blast, the sound at first, when one is too near, does not seem too very pleasing, for distance lends enchantment to the sound. But wait a moment and listen. Far off across the valley, the strains are caught up and sent back from the tops of the high mountains. Then it sounds as if a great choir of angels had come down from heaven to sing glory to God and to bring greetings to all good souls. Nowhere in all the world is there such sweet music made by echoes. Sometimes there is a double set of echoes, like one rainbow inside of another. Then it makes one think of a choir of little angels that sing a second time after the first heavenly chorus has ceased. How the Swiss people first received the Alpine horn as a gift from the fairies is told in the story of a faithful shepherd's boy named Perod. He had to work hard all day in tending the cows that grazed on the high mountain pastures, which the natives call the Alps. But when foreign people speak of the Alps, they mean the ranges of mountains themselves. In winter, these level stretches of ground are covered with snow and ice, but by the month of June, it is warm enough for the grass and flowers to grow. Then the cowboys and cheese makers go up with their cattle. At night, Perod, having milked the cows, skimmed the cream off the milk, hung the great cauldron over the fire, and made the cheese. By this time, that is, well into the late hours, Perod was almost tired to death. After calling good night to Luquette, his sweetheart, who lived across the valley, and hearing her greeting in answer, he climbed up the ladder into the loft and lay down on his bed. This was only a pile of straw, but he was asleep almost the very moment he touched it, for he was a healthy lad and the mountain air was better than medicine. It was especially good for sound sleep, and he knew he must get up early at sunrise to lead the cows and goats out to pasture. Then the all-day concert of tinkling bells began. But this night, instead of slumber, without once waking until day dawn, Parrot had closed his eyes for only about 3 hours when he heard a crackling sound which waked him up. He thought at first the wind was blowing hard enough to rip off some of the bark strips from the roof of the chalet, and was tumbling down some of the heavy stones laid on to keep them in place. But when he saw the reflection on the walls and ceiling of a bright fire, he crawled quietly out of bed. Then he peeped down and through the cracks in the board floor to see what was going on. 3 men were around the fire. One, the biggest fellow of the 3, was hanging up the cauldron on the hooks. The second piled on more wood, while the others warmed their hands in the bright blaze. The three men were all different in appearance, the one from the other, and a strange looking lot they were. The tremendously tall man seemed to be a giant in weight and size. His sleeves were rolled up, showing that his arms were sunburnt until they were very dark. When he lifted up the cauldron to hang it up or take it down, his muscles stood out like whipcords. But the man sitting on a milking stool at the right-hand side of the fireplace was entirely different, being smaller and with a white skin and golden hair. He had a long horn which rested on the floor beside him. The man on the left-hand side of the fireplace appeared to be a woodman or hunter. At least he seemed to be used to the forest. Though it was pitch dark night, he knew where the wood lay, piled up under the eaves of the chalet, for when the fire burned low, he went outdoors and returned with an armload of wooden logs. Then he piled up the wood, and the fire blazed and crackled and roared until the boy in the loft thought the hut would be burned up too. Yet, though he trembled at the strange sight, he was brave. He resolved not to be quiet. If the big men tried to steal his cheese, which was to be food for the family during the winter. Just as he was wondering whether his sisters and old daddy would have enough to eat during the long cold winter of 8 months that was soon coming, when snow and ice covered the fields, he saw a curious thing happen. Sweet music began, such as had never met his ears before, since he was in his cradle and his mother sang to him. It was the man with the golden hair who seemed to be the real gentleman of the party. He it was who made the music. He first handed something to the giant, who dropped it into the cauldron. Then, with his horn, he disappeared through the door. When outside, he lifted the instrument to his lips and blew a blast. Parrot was so interested in watching the giant that he paid little attention to the man outside or to the sound he had made, for he saw the hunter take a bottle out of his pocket and hand it over to the biggest fellow, who stood at the cauldron over the fire. This one poured the liquid, which seemed to be blood red, into the big iron pot. Then, with a ladle as big as a shovel and long as a gun, he stirred vigorously. Then 3 beakers or cups were set upon the table. By this time, the golden-haired man outside had finished his blast of music, which seemed to float across the valleys down into the deltas, over the pastures, and through the wood. It grew sweeter and sweeter as it swelled on the gentle night breeze, until all the mountains seemed to have awakened, turned into living angels, and lifted up their voices. The sweet strain ended with a prolonged sad note, as if melancholy had fallen on the musicians, and then it ceased. A strange thing happened. All the cows and goats woke up from their sleep, and one from all directions could hear the tinkling of their neck bells all over the pastures, far and near. The poor creatures thought it was time to get up and be milked, but they were puzzled to find it yet was dark. In fact, they were all still quite sleepy and very slow to move. Something even far more wonderful happened next. Parrot, after first hearing the horn blow, thought the music had ceased, when, suddenly, it all seemed to come back in greater volume. The sounds were multiplied, as if 1,000 echoes had blended into one, and all heaven had joined in the melody. Herod was entranced. He even closed his eyes lest he might, by looking down at the strange men, lose some of what seemed to him a choir of angels singing. When the last strain had ceased, Herod opened his eyes. The golden-haired musician had re-entered the chalet and resumed his seat, sitting down again on the milk stool at the right of the fire, while the hunter rearranged 3 glass goblets on the rough wooden table from which Perret ate his meals. All 3 of the strangers then solemnly watched the cauldron as the liquid boiled, just as the cream does when cheese is to be made, the big man stirring up with this huge ladle. At a particular moment, the giant lifted the cauldron and emptied out the contents into the 3 glass vessels. To the amazement of Perret, there issued from the same vessel 3 very different colors. In the first glass, filled to the brim, the draught was as red as blood, and it foamed at the top. The drops, flying out on the board, left crimson stains. Giving a tap to the cauldron with the big ladle, the tall man let flow into the second glass what seemed to be the same liquid, but this time it was as green as grass, but hissing hot and bubbling. Another loud ladle tap on the cauldron, and out flowed a stream as cold as snow water and as white as the edelweiss flower. The liquid rested in the goblet as quiet as milk, but seemed to be frosty on the top. Now the giant-like fellow, shaking his huge ladle in his right hand and putting his left at the side of his mouth, shouted with a voice of thunder, "Come down, young boy, and make your choice of one of these 3. Each has a glorious gift to him who drinks. Come quick, for it will soon be daylight." Perret knew he was discovered, but he was a brave boy. If his legs trembled, his heart was big. Moreover, the golden-haired man gave him a nod and winked his eye to encourage the lad. So Perret at once climbed down and stood before the table, on which were the 3 chalices. "Drink, young friend," said the giant, "from any one of these, but know that in the red liquid is a gift to the Swiss man. Drain this cup, and then you will have strength like me." At that he bent his arm to show his mighty muscles. "You will be able to conquer the strongest man or fiercest beast. Besides, I shall give you 100 fat cows, each of which will yield much milk, rich in butter. Drain this cup, and according to my promise, you will see the kine tomorrow." Then the hunter spoke. "Better drink from my goblet. After this green draught, you will have all the gold you want and heaps of coin, and then you can marry and still easily support your old father and mother." So saying, he tossed handfuls of gold pieces on the floor, piling them up, until they reached the lad's knees. Parrot opened his eyes wide in astonishment, for here was not a promise in words, but the actual thing that he could see for himself. He was just about to stretch both his hands and drink the green liquid when the golden-haired man, speaking gently to Parrot, said, "I cannot promise you either cows or coins, but if you drink the liquid in the white goblet, you will be able to use this horn, make music in the mountains, and call your cows as I have done. Thus your flocks and herds will always share with you my gift." Not a minute did Parrot wait to decide. "I care more for music than for money or strength," he said, and lifting the glass, he put it to his lips and drained the cup dry. "What was it, and how did it taste?" you ask. It was what the cows gave him every day, pure fresh milk, but cold as glacier water. "Good," cried the man with the golden hair. "Any other choice would have meant death. Here is the horn. Blow it tomorrow, and see what will happen." As if lifted up on wings to his straw bed, but holding on to his horn, Parrot he heard the door shut and bang as the three men went out, two of them scowling. Then the fire cooled to ashes. He fell asleep and dreamed of the time when, in the church, he should lead his bride to the altar, his lovely sweetheart, Luquette, to be married, and the two should have a chateau and home of their own. Awakening at the first moment when the rosy light of the rising sun made the face of the mountains blush, even while the valleys below were still in darkness, and long before his sisters in the village far away had awakened, he rushed out to the edge of the pasture. Then he drew in a man's breath, filled his lungs, and putting his lips to the mouthpiece of the horn, blew a long blast. He listened eagerly for the far-off echoes. A pleasant double surprise awaited him. All over the pastures, in the chalet of the high plateau, and along the mountain slopes, even down to the valleys, there was heard at once the tinkling of goat bells, cow bells, and the sound even of what hung in the metal collars of donkeys and horses, until the chorus of bell music was wonderful. "Very fine, but is that it?" thought Parrot. But another surprise! From across the great ravine or chasm, out rushed his beloved Luquette. Hastily throwing a wrap around her shoulders, she stood in bare feet, threw a kiss to Parrot, and shouted to him her joy. Now came the crowning wonder. From the high peaks, miles distant, and now rosy red in the dayspring, came back the music in multiplied echoes, as if all the snow ranges of the Alps were singing. Pure, sweet, prolonged. The boy thought of what he had heard in the church, that at creation the morning stars sang together. So it seemed now to him. Through many centuries, and to this day, to call the cows together, to make the goats look up and turn homeward, to seek shelter of the night, for men's evening prayer and chant of thanksgiving, for the signals of defense against enemies, for beginning the feast of dance, or to sound the wedding joy. The Alpine horn is the delight of the Swiss. It is like the carillons of the Belgic folk, the chimes of Normandy, the tower music of Holland, or the bagpipes of the Highlander. In a foreign land, in dreams, in its memories, it tells of home, sweet home. And that is the end of the third story. Of course, do get some rest, Ura. I'm glad you were here to enjoy story time together with me. In fact, I hope that more than one of you was able to find some gentle, fine rest by now, as my voice is here to put you to sleep. I want you to enjoy your rest. I want you to lay down and feel soft and cozy. In fact, I want you to think of nothing at all and only have my voice in your mind as we go on to our fourth fairy tale. This one is called The Whimsical Avalanche, and it goes like this. Take care, LJ. It may happen in Switzerland that mighty masses of snow and ice, sometimes as big as the Capitol at Washington and as high as Bunker Hill Monument, will roll down the mountain sides without giving any notice. These crush whole forests, bury villages, tear rocks to pieces, knock off bits of the mountain sides, and end thousands of lives of people, cows, goats, and horses. Though large enough to engulf an army or a battleship, they are very small when first born up in the very high Alps. Starting as a snowball, they grow large very quickly every moment and finally become immense. Then they roll along over many miles, carrying destruction in their path until they tumble over precipices or reach lowland that is level. That is the reason why they are so named, for avalanche means to the valley. There are many causes of an avalanche, and a little thing may start one of these terrors. The irregular melting by the morning sun of ice in light or shade, the fall of an icicle, the tumbling of a stone, or a sliver of rock, or even the firing of a gun which shakes the overhanging or piled up snow, will begin one of these revolving globes. Now, in old times, all Swiss folk used to think that an avalanche was alive and was having a jolly time, enjoying itself, when sliding and rolling, leaping and dashing down the mountain slopes in its mad race, from the sky to the plain. This was its way of enjoying itself, with a short life and a merry one. It grew faster than anything else known, for while a glacier might take 1,000 years to develop from snowflakes into miles of solid ice, like a frozen river, it required only a few minutes for an avalanche to spring from babyhood into full size, with a power exceeding that of 1,000 giants. Being at its birth only an inch or two in diameter, this infant son of the king of the frost giants, the avalanche soon became the child, which, as it grew up so terribly fast, took after its daddy. It liked to flatten out trees and houses and smash things. It generally so frightened men, dogs, cats, and the big animals that dared to come near the everlasting heights of ice and snow where the frost giants lived, that in odd times no one in winter went up to the high peaks. As a rule, nobody knows, either in summer or winter, just when the avalanches will fall, or whether they will be made of light, powdery, dry snow, or of snow that is heavy, wet, and like what the boys call soakers. Yet there are some old men in Switzerland who can foretell avalanches, as our wise men try to do with the weather. Once upon a time, the frost giant's baby, of which we are going to tell, was born, and great things were expected of it, even when it was only as big as a snowflake. But when it grew up to be a real avalanche, it behaved very differently from all the others. It disappointed its daddy and its uncles awfully. The frost giants like to make all the mischief they can, while this one wanted to help men instead of hurting them, and made a new record in the history of colossal snowballs. It was on a summer's day when the frost giants all gathered together on a big mountain top to celebrate the birthday of their king. On his part, he was to treat them to a sight of an unusually wonderful baby. It was to be in the form of a ball of snow that, when it became a mighty mass, would wipe out one great forest, two big villages, with all the people and cattle in it, and then roll into the valley. There it would destroy hundreds of acres of farms and vineyards, block up the roads, multiply funerals, and waste so many millions of men's dollars that years would pass away before prosperity and good times would come again. The Frost King had a map of the route which the young avalanche was to travel, and he showed it around freely. This was what the frost giants loved to do, for they hated flowers and butterflies and cows and men. When the white frost giants had come together, and all had arrived in their coats of hard snow, and with long beards of icicles, the Frost King invited them to gather at the edge of a precipice under a jagged peak that had many times been riven and splintered by lightning. Then he bade them look down over the landscape while he pointed out the track which he expected his hopeful offspring, the newborn avalanche, was to take from the time it started until it had done its work in leveling forests, villages, and vineyards. Then, using the big palm of his hand as a diagram and his 5 fingers as pointers, just as a fortune teller finds out and assures a girl what kind of husband she will have, he told them just what he was sure would happen. On reaching the valley, the big bowl would spread itself over a square mile or two, while covering up and ruining the grain fields. After that, it would take the sunshine and warm south wind at least 2 or 3 years to melt the mass, while thousands of people would be in mourning for their dead children and kinsfolk. Or, reduced to beggary, they would bewail the loss of all they had in this world. To hear the old Frost King, as his tongue wagged, and the icicles of his beard flopped up and down, as the chief chin chopper of the party, you would have thought that this baby avalanche that was to start the day was the greatest and most famous ever known. Now watch, said the Frost King. It was midday in midsummer, and the heat was great as he took up a mass of wet snow, hardly more than a dipper full, but already made soft by the sun's rays. He squeezed the mass hard between the palms of his hands. To the frost giants, it seemed scarcely bigger than a pill. Then, striking an attitude like a baseball pitcher or a man playing tenpins and about to roll the ball along down the alley, the Frost King held up before them the dark gray, sticky ball. As he fondled and patted it as his own child, the Frost King called out, I name thee my son, Soaker Smash All, and I expect thee to break all records. Make the widest swathe of ruin, my son, ever known among men. The sun is mine enemy, and through thee I shall spoil his work and give him plenty of labor to restore it. Go. Saying this, the toss was made and the bowl set rolling. At first, for several seconds, with Soaker Smash All, it was more like plowing than rolling its way through the drifts, for the slope was slight. Then, as the incline grew more steep, the tumbling became more rapid, until about a half-mile from the starting point, the baby avalanche had, by its leaps and bounds, grown so fast as to be already as big as a barn. It was bouncing swiftly along, when instead of going straight ahead, as its daddy the Frost King had planned and expected, it rolled against a rounded rock that curved up and backwards, like the dashboard of a sleigh or the roof of a pagoda. At once it swerved to the right and bounded high up in the air, as though some frost giant was playing football and was trying to hit the goal. Then all sorts of funny things began to happen. The frost giants were terribly disappointed at seeing their pet mount up in the air like a pigskin ball from the foot of a first-class kicker, even before it was half grown. To behave so differently from what its daddy had felt sure of and told the frost giants it would do seemed like disobedience. For was not this avalanche the Frost King's son? Instead of rolling straight down the valley, gathering force for its final plunge, at every yard, it was apparently trying to climb up to the moon. The youngster is altogether too smart, whispered one old giant to another. Just a second or two before this baby avalanche seemed to have lost both its head and its path. To go aside and play in the deep valley below, there was a hunter on one side of the ravine who had climbed up the high rocks to get a shot at a herd of ibex that were feeding quietly on the other side. Besides the buck, there were 4 mothers, each with a pretty little kid, hardly 2 months old. Now it was not the season for hunting, and it was against the law, which allowed the mother ibex a quiet interval and the kids time to grow up. For an ibex kid needs to be educated, just as a child does. But this fellow, named Ernie, was both cruel and lawless. He had brought his spyglass with him, and pulling it out, swept the distant faces of the great cliffs to find his game. Just as this promising family, a buck with a harem of 4 does and as many kids, hove in sight, his fancy was tickled. Law or no law, he would shoot. He laid down his glass, pointed the rifle, and took cool aim, hoping to bring down two of the ibex at a shot. Then he pulled the trigger. With that gun, it was a cease of a fire at one end and a fool at the other. Alas for human hopes! There is many a slip between muzzle and game. In this case, a miss was as good as a mile or even a league. In the cruel hunter's brain there had been already a flitting vision of venison pot pie and ibex steak. He even saw, in his daydream, two fine pairs of mounted horns adorning his parlor walls. But the daddy of the ibex family had, a second before, thrown up his nose and caught a whiff of some human being near. Looking up in alarm, he saw the huge snowball in the air above him. Giving the usual sort of whistle, as ibex sentinels do, the whole family started to run, as if racing with the wind to get under the shelter of an overhanging rock. Already the bullet had sped, and despite their speed, one or two ibex might have fallen, but the movement of an avalanche had so thickened and condensed the air that it was like firing a pellet of lead into molasses, making the ball go slowly. This was what is called the wind of the avalanche, which sometimes kills men and beasts. Instead of the heart of an ibex, the rifle bullet struck the monster snowball in the center, but it hurt the avalanche no more than a flea bite on the end of an elephant's tail. We cannot here tell what Ernie, the enraged hunter, said. Having lost the whole day in climbing and now tired, hungry, and vexed with disappointment, he trudged back. When he reached home, his wife kept quiet, his children had to keep away from him, and he did not say his prayers that night. On the contrary, in the forest home of the ibex, there was much rejoicing, for they had heard the ring of the rifle and seen its flash. In fact, avalanches were very popular in ibex society, for even when one was seen coming soon enough, the bucks and does could easily dodge them. And that's the end of the third story. Welcome in, ants, and thank you so much for the hydrate and stretch part. I will make sure to look after myself and my back and make sure I am quite as cozy as I hope most of you are here in my reading chair. And I will most certainly take a nice drink, as I think we have at least one or two more stories left in us. So, my sweethearts, I hope that some of you have gently fallen asleep by now, or at least your eyelids are so heavy that you simply cannot take to look at the screen or your phone or wherever it is that you are comfortable. Because all that matters right now is my voice, reading you to sleep, bringing you all the rest in the world, and hopefully spinning you a pleasant dream. So get cozy and get comfy, and let all of your worries sink out of your shoulders as I read the fifth story in our little book. This one is called The Mountain Giants, and it goes something like this. Long ages ago, when the round earth was being shaped and the ice was melting to give way to green fields and flowers, huge monsters, bears, wolves, and other wild animals were the only living creatures in Switzerland. Then the giants arrived on the world. When, by and by, human beings came into the land, they told their children that the mountains were what were left of the earth's crust after it had shrunk into peaks and ridges, humps and hollows, like an apple when baked in the oven, making crusts, points, and wrinkles. The valleys had been sunk by the giants walking about on earth while it was yet soft. The rivers were formed by the weeping of the giants' wives and daughters when they were badly treated, for these rough fellows, husbands and brothers, did not know how to be kind to their female kin. The only way the giants were able to make their women obey them when they were bad tempered or naughty or scolded too much was to use shovels, pokers, clubs, or straps on them. This clumsy and cruel way of keeping the family in order was because the giants had not yet learned to love, but were like brutes and knew only about force. These giants, though so big, were very stupid as compared with men. Their brains were more like those of babies, and they were not half as smart as boys and girls are today. They did not know enough even to plow the ground and raise wheat and rye and oats and to make porridge, to say nothing of bread and cakes and pies and doughnuts. They could not melt lead or work iron or make tools, but depended on their muscles because these were huge and tough so that they bulged out, for the giants had terrific strength like bulls and elephants. Though their brains were so small, their limbs were like pillars, much thicker than piano legs, and their arms were like iron. They could only make hammers or chisels, knives and scrapers of stone, and clubs of wood, for they knew no better and never went to school or college. When men finally arrived on the earth and began to plow the ground and to raise wheat for bread and brought cows for milk, the giants, and especially the giantesses, were mightily interested. Their curiosity was great to see how the things were done and how houses were built and cradles were made for babies to sleep in. The giants told their sons and daughters not to meddle with the human folk, but rather to help them. For the giants, dull as their wits were afraid of any creature that, though smaller than they were, had more brains. They wondered how human beings got such big heads, and they often pounded on each other's skulls to see if they were hollow inside, like a coconut. Now the biggest of all these big fellows was their king, named Gargantua, but men learned to call him Old Gargi. He had only one daughter, Bertha, who was his pet. She was a pretty good giantess, but she always wanted to have her own way, and this often made trouble in the family. Daddy and Mamma could not always agree about her. Bertha knew how to get on old Gargi's soft side and sweeten his temper. Too often her indulgent father either let her have her own way or gave what she begged of him, or else he winked at and overlooked some of her foolish pranks. One day, when her daddy and mama were asleep, she sneaked out from the cave on her tiptoes and slipped down a glacier. When on solid ground, she ran like a deer up into the valley, where she saw a farmer with two horses making furrows in the field. Amused at this, she stood and watched, while perched on a boulder, looking on with wonder. Then the young giantess burst out laughing. "How funny to make stripes and little gutters all along the ground," she said to herself. Then she walked up to where the man was, and lifting him, his plow, and both his horses in one of her big hands, she held out her apron open wide and dropped the whole lot, man, team, and tools, into it. These she took home to play with on the cave floor. Her mother looked on and enjoyed the fun as her daughter pulled the horses' tails and made them kick. She forced the man to dance on her thumbnail and used the iron end of the plow to clean her fingernails. The man talked and whined and wanted to go home to his wife and babies, but the giantess Bertha could not understand a word he said. So she spoke to her mother thus: "This must be his way of frowning, like a wolf cub. Or maybe he is chattering like a monkey. Or is he crying, do you suppose?" At this, the shadow of old Gargi darkened the cave door. He saw what was being done and instantly ordered the release of the man and his horses. Then he lifted his club as a sign of securing obedience. The jolly giantess Bertha, having had her fun, took back the man and his team into the valley. The farmer's wife was so grateful that she wanted to make her visitor a nice present. She took from the corner of the room something brown. It was 4 foot long and stood there on the end with others like it. They looked like clubs, but seemed very light. These were loaves of Swiss rye bread that were kept standing on their ends in the spring house and were called the staff of life. A thick round cheese, a pot of honey, and a full pail of milk were also given to Bertha for a present. The giantess ate heartily. She drank a bucket full of the milk, chewed up a cheese and a yard of bread, and then asked for more to take home, which was willingly given. When back in the cave, the giant family had a jolly feast. At least, each one had a mouthful. They all smacked their lips and murmured, in their delight. Down in the valley, the farmer's wife, although the sky was blue and the sun shining, thought it was thundering or that an avalanche had fallen down the mountain. But it was only the giant family showing how happy they were at eating the food of human beings. "So you see, daughter Bertha," said old Gargi, her daddy, "what these human creatures can do for us. So do you let them alone, and in the future harm them not, even in play. Then they will give us more bread and cheese and milk." The good daughter placed one of the big cheeses, still uneaten, upon her thumbnail as a sign of truth. Then she declared she never would disturb anything, man or beast, in the valley. Now there was another giant named Hotep, who in disposition was very different from his neighbor and often played bad tricks on the farmers. He loved to start avalanches by making a wet snowball called a soaker and then flinging it over the snow and down into the valley upon the villages. In this way, he ruined many houses, barns, and stables, killing men, goats, sheep, donkeys, chickens, and cattle. Besides this, Hotap used to lie in wait for nice little boys, especially those that were rosy and plump, and to catch them and eat them up. He sometimes came back to his cave home with his pockets full of small boys. He thus ruined so many families and made so many mothers cry that they sometimes called him Old Shop, which means something like boy eater, or more exactly, our John Barleycorn. But Shop was a giant that destroyed many more small boys than any other giant or ogre, and in a different way. By and by, Hotap and Shop, who at first were rivals, became partners. Instead of living in caves, they went into business and set up shops all over Switzerland. They lured young men into these shops and set them to drinking poisonous stuff, which the giants made, so that the roads and streets and gutters and nights and early in the mornings were often full of fellows lying asleep on the ground or like pigs in the mud. Then, further, the two giants made it the general fashion of putting Shop's drink even into things cooked for children. Hotap found that, as partner to Shop, he could catch and destroy more boys in this new business than in the old way. So he laid aside his club and stopped trying to destroy villages by rolling avalanches on them. He put on fine clothes and made his shops very attractive by looking glasses and pretty pitchers and tumblers. But finally he himself got so fond of the drink which Shop made out of barley and rye and other grain that he drank himself to death and was buried in a cemetery. Over his grave a monument was carved in the shape of a barrel, with a bung and spout and tap, as if he were continuing business in the next world. But Shop kept on in his business. He ground up grain and wasted so much that he made the price of bread very high, so that poor people often had to go hungry. Out of the good barley and rye he made the stuff that poisoned the brains of the young men and turned them into flapjacks, so that they lay as stupid as stones in the ground. He filled up the men until they were hardly better than swill barrels. In this way, many boys were ground up into poverty or stupidity, and the graveyards were filled so fast by old Shop that people called his saloon the mill. At last, the big fat yellow with a red nose died also. So at Bern, one sees the monument of Shop or Boy Eater. He stands in bronze over a fountain. He has boys in his pocket, samples of boys in his hands and mouth, some more at his feet, and a good supply at hand to chew up and swallow. Everyone goes to see the statue of the Boy Eater, yet many others still follow his business and eat up the boys. And that's the end of the fifth story about giants up in the mountains and the kind of havoc they wreak among people. Was that a cautionary tale about alcohol? Yes, I do believe so, Bard. I do believe so. For I suppose there would be nothing more scarier to children than the prospect of giants poisoning their minds and eating them up like that. I suppose that is what a lot of these tales are in the end. Tales of caution, told in villages, around a campfire, in a warm home, or somewhere out in the meadow to pass the time. And now we get to hear them, to at least have an idea of what life was like in the times long past. And I have to say, I do quite enjoy it. I certainly hope that you have had a wonderful and enjoyable time here with me, because I think that has been quite enough for our reading of bedtime stories for my darlings. So let me just take a little time to wish you all good night, to thank you so much for being here with me, for listening to my voice, for caring about a story or two, and for giving me your company. I am most grateful to have all of you here resting by my side. Hmm. And for next week, I think we can continue because I have certainly enjoyed myself, and it does bring comfort to one's soul to have a nice weekly place of rest and gentle joy. So if I can do this for a very long time, I will, for you. So come again next week to listen to a story or two, or three, or four, or how many it is that I think I can fit within 2 hours, as some of you slowly fall asleep. So I think I'm going to end it there, and I will let you all rest, falling into a gentle slumber. So remember, my darlings, as I always say, my eternal light will be with you always.